Marlon Brando and Charles Laughton occupy a very interesting space in the history of film. Both men are championed, and rightly so, as two of the greatest actors of all time. These two men also directed one film each. These men both produced one singular masterpiece and never again stepped behind the lens. Laughton's film was The Night of the Hunter, a Southern Gothic love letter to the silent epics of D.W. Griffith. And Brando's submission was a colossal train wreck. Brando directed and starred in a western called One-Eyed Jacks, and it's still one of the most misunderstood westerns ever made. Mostly because it's a goddamn masterwork. Westerns are positively obsessed with fatalism. This cosmic pessimism can be explosively nihilistic, as Sam Peckinpah would express, or it can be remarkably subtle, like the stoically mortified males of the Hoxian morality plays in Red River. Sergio Leone's films were madly driven by a mystically suspicious force, by a preordained and operatic destiny. John Ford and Delmer Daves were also preoccupied with the inherent cynicism of the unequivocally American Western. Our filmmakers of today who experiment with the Western genre, like Quentin Tarantino, Andrew Dominik, and the Coen brothers, raise their voices in some oddly disparate unison with the fatalistic standards of the pessimistic past. Point is, Westerns have always wanted to kill themselves. Marlon Brando just pulled the trigger on them. One-Eyed Jacks is the Western suicide note. Marlon Brando filmed the whole writhing act, the entire ungodly deed. He orchestrated the symbolic death of the American screen bandit and ultimately castrated the ultimate American film genre. And he did it all with a psychotic obsession. He did it all with a madman's perseverance and severity. He did it all of it, wonderfully. One-Eyed Jacks is Marlon Brando's self-psychoanalysis writ large. There is so much of Brando in this film, so much self-projection and self-degradation, that One-Eyed Jacks is more than simply a Western. It is a psychological assessment of the cinema at large and a complicated character study of the Marlon Brando persona itself. Even at the surface levels, this is a very combative picture. The first layer of psychological skin that makes up its troubling calluses, its deconstructionism. Brando half-heartedly props up easily identifiable tropes and dissects them with the same amount of classically contrived pathos. It's a brilliantly twisted and evil game Brando plays. The man doesn't even attempt to hold your hand. Marlon Brando's goal was to deconstruct Western mythos to the point of absurdity and chaos, all while perpetuating his own private madness on the world. One-Eyed Jacks is both startlingly insular and direct in highly unusual ways. This is because Brando is not a practiced filmmaker. He's an actor, the best that ever lived, which means he understands emotions, virile trajectories, and impassioned pathology better than just about any director ever could. One-Eyed Jacks is akin to peering inside of Brando's creative process. How he approached directing One-Eyed Jacks is how he approached his acting roles. This is how deep Brando swims. This is how positively haunted Brando was. Disturbing psychological complexes repeating its visual stylistic motifs. Marlon Brando as the humiliated king. It's almost as if Brando attempted to expose filmmaking as a terrible way to waste your talent and time. It's as if he tried to sabotage his own film. I refuse to believe that a man as intelligent and artistically deliberate as Brando failed to see the ironic dichotomy that he made manifest between the film itself and the filmmaking process. One-Eyed Jacks is littered with Freudian symbolism and a visually psychoanalytical film grammar. The fact that the film's compulsively tortured production seems largely to be on account of Brando's own bipolar id, his world-famous ego, and his carefully curated and implosive superego makes for gallows-enough humor to compel Freud himself to bust a gut laughing. Brando was so absolutely possessed by acting that I believed he turned not only the production of One-Eyed Jacks into an absurdly Freudian fireworks display, but he transformed the rest of his life into something resembling performance art hereafter. Brando's opus is part postmodern symphony, part visual fugue, and largely defeatist. Pessimistic in the most beautifully philosophical ways. One-Eyed Jacks is a treasure trove of extremely challenging ideas where someone like Kubrick dealt deftly with physically spatial impossibilities. Brando's film explores psychologically impossible frameworks. The Freudian concepts are syrupy thick and just as sweet. It's the good, the bad, and the Oedipal. An Oedipus pun, forgive me. Longtime Brando acting partner Carl Malden operated as the perfect fatherly foil to Brando's psychosexual bandit and symbolically castrated killer Rio. Both actors commit to One-Eyed Jack some of their finest work and certainly their most sophisticated character portrayals. In Brando's film, romance assumes dangerously pessimistic features and perverse contour lines. Forget everything you think you know about the American Western. In Brando's film, public male punishment and grotesque patriarchal humiliation is more psychosexually erotic, classically masculine, and deplorably impassioned than anything else in the universe. Westerns are nothing without their implied mythos. I love mythology. As an absurdist, I'm quite partial to the power of archetypes, considering it took the retelling of a myth to express the absurd. See the myth of Sisyphus. I basically feel that the human experience and I think that human experience and meaning is simply too much to be stored inside of us, so we ingratiate the entirety of the human condition in icons, archetypes, and creations. Lately, though, I have been attempting to incorporate more out-there elements, the God archetype of the Sephirot, Merkaba, and Jungian collective unconsciousness, that sort of thing. I've been toying around with the possibility of a psychic spatial reality that these myths and symbols occupy. I've been experimenting with tarot and rune divination to see if there's some sort of psychic or emotionally palpable power I can harness from these symbols. I'm achingly self-aware of what I'm saying. I'm playing around with the concept of group actualization. If enough people believe in the same God archetype or things of that caliber, like on-screen cowboys, for instance, I think it might be possible that these believed-in constructs can become nearly psychically sentient. One-Eyed Jacks shows me the Freudian consequences of this psycho-mystical line of thinking. Brando's retort to my archetypal reasoning is harsh, genuinely articulate, and crushing. One-Eyed Jacks forces me to watch my theory come to macabre life. Brando is telling me this is what happens when you breathe life into icons. He's saying this is what happens when the corpses of dead gods fill your brain. He's practically screaming at me. This is what happens when archetypes become real. This is what happens when titans live. They die, and they die embarrassingly slow and for shallow reasons. They are predictable by definition and cardboard by default. Brando yops, I'll show you your living gods. I'll film their faces, and I'll totally annihilate their inanimate compositions by deconstructing them all into indiscernible scribbles. He hollers at me, these are your stupid symbols. This is your artistic iconography. It's all hollow. It's all illusory. They can't withstand psychoanalysis. They're too weak to be real, unconsciously or otherwise. You can share them, sure, but you can never conjure them. He bellows about sentimentality and how it's gross, roars about how I've terribly misunderstood the concept of romanticism. His voice tremors and the earth quakes as he berates me for my misuse of melodrama, for how I've wrongly imbibed mythos, mistaking fables for human tenderness. Your gods have failed you, Marlin says to me with eyes of knowing embers. He tells me that the Western is dead, that all film does is lie to me, that Joseph Campbell was a prick, that Jung was a crackpot, that mythologies do not possess a shared psychosis, and that there is nothing at all animate or lifelike about the symbols of man. He tells me all of this and I listen. I watch. One-Eyed Jacks not only defeated its maker, Brando, but it cruelly disemboweled me as well. Me and all of my dead gods. I'd like to note how capable Brando was as a visual stylist. I think One-Eyed Jacks is a remarkably good-looking film, one that speaks with an erudite cinematic grammar that catapults its psychology into serenely kinetic dimensions. Every frame of this film is perfectly composed, and I'm extremely in awe of its dynamically meaningful scope and reach. Brando obviously knew how to capture moments, express fully realized and developed ideas, and forge his own uniquely pessimistic human character into poetic film languages. It feels a lot like Antonioni and Eisenstein make a Western. One-Eyed Jacks is fast becoming one of my favorite films. It's so confrontational and life-altering because it's supernally quarrelsome with everything around it. The film is like antimatter, and it's deeply antagonistic. All things it comes in contact with, it psychologically destroys. There are so many beautiful qualities to be found in Brando's Western contempt. It's simply one of the most gorgeously rendered philosophies I've ever had the pleasure of being positively defeated by. No match for the Wild Bunch, of course. The Wild Bunch would also devour this philosophy. Nothing is a match for Sam Peckinpah's ultimate masterpiece. But Marlon Brando was defeated by his own film, too. Make no mistake about that. He made a film that was too powerful to be appreciated, too complex to be understood, and too tyrannical to let anything survive in its wake. Marlon Brando may have directed one of the most mighty films ever made. It was called One-Eyed Jacks, and you will know it by the sound of the wounded ones. Yeah, this is another essential Western that you definitely have to watch. It's so good. It's very good, and it's criminally underseen and undervalued even when people do see it. Filmmakers need to bring a level of complexity to their movie watching, because this film is immediately challenging philosophically and psychologically. It's intense. A beautiful picture, a beautiful Western, beautifully acted. Cinema can be a very, very damaging, thrilling, and romantic thing. Thank you.